Hi guys, today we're going to talk about simplifying rational expressions. So the first step is to find the least common denominator. The way that and then after you do that, you're going to multiply each expression by the part it is missing from the denominator, and then state the restrictions from the original expression. So what's happening is we are getting a common denominator in order to add two rational expressions together, or subtract. So least common denominator is the smallest of all the possible denominators that all the terms have in common. So I'll show you how to find that. The first two have common denominators, the examples that we're going to look at, just to kind of review how to add and subtract fractions. And then to find it, you're going to have all the factors, make sure one of each factor is included. And if there are factors in common, then that factor only needs to be listed one time. Okay, so let's get started. Here's some examples. We have the same denominator in both of these. So we don't have to factor or do anything crazy. Those are already factored. The common denominator is 2c minus 1. So because the denominator is already common, that means all I have to do is add the numerator because we have a common denominator. So when we add two rational expressions together, if they have the same denominator, we just add their numerators. So I'm going to simplify that. 3c plus 5c is 8c minus 1 divided by 2c minus 1. There are no factors that all of those have in common. So a lot of people try to cross out the negative ones, but the 8c and the negative 1 go together, and the 2c and the negative 1 go together, so you can't do that. So this would be our final answer for this one. Okay. The restrictions come from the denominator, and we've talked about this all year. So if the denominator were to equal 0, and if this was a rational expression, then it would be an undefined, or that makes it undefined. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the denominator equal to 0. So that'd be 2c minus 1 equals 0. And solve it. So that'd be 2c equals 1. C is 1/2. So you'd say C cannot be 1/2. So that's how you find the restrictions. Okay. So let's look at the second one. Again, we have the same denominator already, so that is the least common denominator. Our restrictions are going to be the same because we just solved it in the other problem. And then the only difference is that in this one it's a subtraction sign. So you have to make sure that you distribute that to all of the terms in that second fraction, second rational expression. So when I do so, I'm going to subtract 5c. So 3c minus 5c is going to be negative 2c. And then negative times a negative 1 is a positive 1. Now, these look really similar to me, and I hope they look similar to you too. If I look at the first one, if I take a negative out of both of those terms, I get the exact same thing that's in the denominator. So technically, those would cancel each other out because they're the same factor, and this would equal negative 1. Now, I hope you get to the point where you can see that. I actually would probably take the answer before it's simplified, but you do need to start looking for those commonalities and see what we can simplify. All right. Now, let's take a look at one that is not the same denominator. So, first thing you're going to do is you're going to factor the denominators. So, for my LCD, and I'm going to do it over here in red, and red pen hopefully, LCD, the first denominator is x times y times y. The second denominator is 4 times x times y. So we need to have each of the factors in that common denominator. So the first thing I see is this 4. So I'm going to go ahead and put, there is a 4. Then I see an x that is in common in both of them. So I've got an x here and an x here. So I also have now an x. I keep doing that with the colors. And then I have another y that's in common. So I'm going to highlight that y, and that adds a y here. And then there's also one last y, so that's this one here. And then I'm going to add that to my common denominator. So my least common denominator is 4xy squared. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set each of those things equal to 0. So the factors that I'm worried about in the denominator are the variables mainly. So x can't be 0 and neither can y. Okay, there is no like y plus 1 or x plus 1 like the other one. So x can't be 0 and y can't be 0, because if they are 0, then that makes the expression undefined and we can't actually add those together. So the first denominator is xy squared. So the factor that it's missing from the common denominator is 4. So I am going to multiply technically the numerator and the denominator by 4, by what it's missing. But when I multiply the denominator by 4, it's going to give me that common denominator. So I'm just going to go ahead and write it as one expression. So then the numerator in the second rational expression, the denominator is 4xy, so it was missing a y. So I'm going to multiply that numerator and denominator by by y in order to get that. So from here, all I'm doing is I'm distributing. So I'm going to say 20y plus 8 plus 2xy minus 4y divided by 4xy squared. And then from there, I can add the y's together. So I've got 20y minus 4y, that's 16y, plus 2xy plus 8. And it doesn't really matter the order that those are in. And then divided by 4xy squared. I can go one step further because if you look at all of those terms, they all have a 2 in common. So let's go ahead and simplify by 2. So I'd have 8y plus xy plus 8 divided by 2 is 4. And then 2xy squared. So that's the only thing that they all have in common. Like I see that they have like a y in common, or at least the first one, the first term in the numerator and the denominator do. But every single term has to have the exact same thing in common in order for us to simplify. All right, so let's take a look at the second page. So when we look at this number 4, we have to find the least common denominator first. So over here, I'm going to go ahead and factor both of those denominators. So the first one, that's a quadratic. So a 4 and a 1 multiply to give me 4, but also add to give me 5. So it's a times c. I have to multiply to give you a times c, add to give you b. So that would be x plus 4 times x plus 1. The second denominator has a 3 in common. So I can factor out that 3, and then I'd have an x plus 1. So if I am taking one of each of those things, I have a 3, I have an x plus 1 that they share, so I only need to write once, and then an x plus 4. I did a lot of color coding on the completed notes, so if you wanted to go and look at the completed notes that are linked after this, you can. Then the restrictions, I'm just going to set each of those equal to 0, so x plus 1, so x can't be negative 1, and x plus 4, so x can't be negative 4. So those are my two restrictions here. X cannot be negative 4 or negative 1. And those will come more in handy when we actually start solving. All right, so the first denominator is x plus 4 times x plus 1 when it's factored. So it's only missing the 3. So I'm going to multiply 3 times the 1. And then I have the second denominator is missing the x plus 4. So I have that 5x and then times the x plus 4. And so that's my numerator. My denominator is now my common denominator. And now I can go from there. I'm going to go ahead and distribute the 5x. So I've got 3 minus 5x squared minus 20x. And then my denominator, 3 times x plus 1 times x plus 4. And then I am just going to reorder. So I have negative 5x squared minus 20x plus 3. And then from there, I'm going to just leave that as my answer. So, easy peasy, nothing too crazy there. The main thing is that you remember how to factor the denominator. And then let's take a look at this last one, number 5. So we need to do a little bit more work on the factoring part because we have an a value that's not 1. So 3y squared minus 10y minus 8. 3 times negative 8 is negative 24. And then negative 12 and positive 2 multiply to give me negative 24 and add to give me negative 10. So I've got 3y squared minus 12y plus 2y minus 8. Group them. Take the 3y out because those two have it in common. And that would be y minus 4. Take the 2 out because they have that in common. Be y minus 4. So we've got 3y plus 2 times y minus 4. So that's the first denominator. The second denominator is y squared minus 6y plus 8, negative 4 and negative 2. Multiply to give you positive 8 and add to give you negative 6. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight our two factored forms over here. Okay, so they share a y minus 4, so that's definitely going to be in our LCD. We've got a 3y plus 2. We've got a y minus 4. And we've also got a y minus 2. If you set each of those equal to 0, that's how you get your restrictions. So y cannot be negative 2/3. And then the other two are pretty easy to set equal to 0. So we've got negative 2/3. Also cannot be 2. Also cannot be 4. Okay. Now we can get to work. So the first denominator is missing the y minus 2 from the LCD. So I'm going to take the 12, multiply it by the y minus 2. And then I'm subtracting the 3 times whatever the second one's missing. And it seems to be missing the 3y plus 2. Now I have the common denominator. And essentially what I'm doing there, y'all, is I'm multiplying by what's missing, but I'm multiplying the numerator and the denominator of that fraction. So like for instance, this one would be like 3y plus 2 over 3y plus 2. And the reason why I do that is because I'm not changing the expression at all, because that technically is equal to 1. So that's what I multiplied the second one by, and technically I multiplied the first one by the y plus 2. And the reason why then I write it how I do is because I know that the denominator is now in common and I can put it together in one step, and it makes it a little easier for you when you're doing your work. So let's distribute. So I've got 12y minus 24 minus 9y minus 6 all over our common denominator. And then let's simplify. So 12y minus 9y is 3y. And then negative 24 minus 6 would be negative 30. And then 3y plus 2, y minus 4 times y minus 2. Now, I see that the numerator has a 3 in common, but if I factor that out, it's not going to make a difference in my answer because I cannot take a 3 out of everything in order to simplify. So I can go ahead and just leave my answer just like this. All right, so that is simplifying rational expressions by adding and subtracting.